Good afternoon. Today we're going to bring you the third video in our series on permaculture design and nature-guided design. Today is going to be a big subject because we're going to talk to you about a lot of the challenges we had when we came here and started our project in the winter of as of December 2019 and going into 2020. We're going to talk to you about the difficulties we had with flooding, with invasive species, with lots of dead trees because of the flooding, and also soil erosion. But what's going to be really interesting is as we lead you through this, we're going to show you how we solved all of these problems using permaculture principles and also nature-guided principles. And so many of the problems within those problems were the solutions. And so that's what we're going to talk to you about today, and it's really exciting. And this may require more than one video, many videos to get through with it. But stick with us, because the thing is, with us, you're going to learn not only how you can grow your own food, but how you can also restore native biodiversity, native plants, native animals, and grow your own food at the same time. And so it's really exciting. I'm really excited about sharing all of this with you. So let's get started. So we're starting here on our main chinampas, which I've spoken about in another video, and I'll get into it a little bit in a few minutes. But what I'd like to underline right now here is this whole area here. You can see where there's sort of, it looks like a big pile of snow here, and then behind it there's some more snow over there that you can see in a flattened area, right up to the cedars and back towards all of those dogwoods. And then over here, this entire area was, within 1 month of us moving in, was completely flooded. We purchased this property in the fall of 2019 after several months of drought. When we had the inspection, everything was bone dry. And we had no idea how much of a flooding problem there was on this property. But we very quickly discovered it, because in January of 2020, there was a record rain and a record snow melt, and then a freeze up afterwards. And that's when we saw, within 1 month, we hadn't even been here a month in January of 2020 when we discovered what was going on. And one of the first things we discovered was this culvert right here, this green pipe, which was under basically a big, huge pile of sod. We saw that there was water coming through it, and it was flooding this entire area. This entire area was underwater, and basically, I'm going to stand in the water down here. Basically, you know, the level of the ground was about this, where I am right now. Okay, so it was very, very low, very wet. But the thing is, this wasn't a wetland. This isn't a wetland, and the species that were growing here weren't wetland species. What was going on here is this water was coming from a pond, a pond that was dug. It was not natural, and that was being fed by diverted water out of a creek that's close by. And the water was constantly being fed into this pond, and so it was creating almost like a new creek here. And but the water had nowhere to go. This canal was not here. This was just all flooded. And so that's to sort of give you the context. When we bought this property, we didn't realize that we didn't really need to farm on the whole thing. we thought we would need to. And so when we came back and we saw this, we said, oh, this is a problem. We need to solve this because we want to plant here. Now, we later learned that out front where we have our main garden, that was very much sufficient for our needs. However, we didn't know that at the time, and I got started right away at trying to solve the challenges. And you're going to see pretty soon that we were quite successful because we're now able to grow food back here. And so I said earlier that we had problems with water flooding, with invasive species, and with dead trees that were dead because of the fact that they had grown before the pond that was put in next door was put in place, and they had started to die. Now this pond was put in place long before we moved in, but what we saw was the results of the pond when we came here. And so what was the solution to this? Well, the solution was, first of all, we needed to deal with the buckthorn. So let's go and have a look at the buckthorn. So in December of 2019 and January of 2020, even before we saw the flooding, what we did see was a forest that was full of non-native and invasive buckthorn, which is this here, this tree right here. And it was also full of a lot of dead trees, fallen trees. Some trees were even suspended in midair because they were held up in the air by a grapevine and so on, wild grapevine. And so we knew there was a problem, but we weren't quite sure what it was yet because we didn't see the flood yet because everything was just under snow and ice. And so, but what we did see was the forest was full of this buckthorn. And buckthorn is a species, it's an invasive species that strangles all the plants around it. Not only if you look at the branches, you can see how thickly its branches grow, and they surround the branches of other trees, but the roots grow in the same way. And so we knew that we had to get rid of a lot of this buckthorn, and so we started to cut it down. Now, luckily not all the trunks were really thick. Some of them, maybe about 40 or so, were maybe twice as thick as this, but most of the buckthorn looked something like this. I never cut this one down. I wanted to keep one to be able to use it as reference. But the thing about buckthorn is when you cut it, all we did was we cut it at ground level. When you cut it at ground level, though, what happens is the following year it sprouts new branches. Okay, that's sort of like what we call pollarding. And but that wasn't for us. That's not really a problem, and I'll show you why. So here's an example of some buckthorn. These were relatively small trees. You can see the trunk here that was cut here, and another one here and here. So these were cut perhaps last year. And then as you can see, during the last growing season in 2023, you have these really long branches that grew in a single season. Okay, so this is a very, it's a species that's full of life. But unfortunately, it strangles all the plants around it, especially if it starts surrounding them. So we have to keep on top of it. But the thing is, this buckthorn, which was everywhere, which was a problem because it wasn't letting the natural species that grow in this area to grow. For instance, there's a lot of oak and maple and white pine, wonderful species. Native to this area, and they weren't really being able to establish themselves because this buckthorn would strangle them out. So the buckthorn was a problem, and the flooding was a problem, but the buckthorn was also part of the solution because we started cutting it and we had lots and lots and lots, and so we got piles and piles and piles, not only of little branches like this, but as the tree I showed you earlier, of quite large trunks, and large, maybe the biggest ones were maybe about 20 centimeters thick, but a lot of them were about this thick and very long. So we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of meters of branches of buckthorn that we had cut. This took us more than a season. This took us probably at least 2 winter seasons. We would do the buckthorn cutting in the winter when it was easy to access everything, and when we wouldn't harm other plants and so on, and when all the plants were were dormant, and we collected all those branches. And what these buckthorn were going to help us do, because we had a two-pronged challenge that we had to deal with. We had to deal with the amount of flooding and try and do something to take care of that. And we also had all this invasive buckthorn. And so now I'm going to show you what we did with the buckthorn and what we did to deal with the flooding. So here's an example of a whole bunch of branches from a tree that had died and fallen down, and we had to cut after it had fallen. One of the many trees that began to die was shortly after we moved in, because actually there were a lot of dead trees, but more were dying because the soil being saturated with water when at one point in the past it hadn't been. And so this is an idea of there's a small pile of branches here to give you an idea of what we did with them. Okay, all sort of forming a type of a net. And then here's a example of some of the dead trees that we had to take care of. And so we took all of those branches of buckthorn, all those hundreds and hundreds of meters of branches of buckthorn, and brought them here, and we started piling them up here. At the same time, we saw this water coming through this pipe. Now this pipe, like I said, it was buried. We didn't know it was here. And we started to dig a canal to direct the water so that rather than staying here, it would actually flow through the property towards the creek on the other side of the property. Now at some point you can see how much water is coming through there now. It's not a whole lot, but I'm going to show you a video image of how much water can come through there at times. At times there's enough water that comes through that it would fill a 20-liter bucket, or 5-gallon bucket, in about 1 or 2 seconds. And that's the equivalent of over 1 million liters, which is a 250,000 gallons of water in 24 hours. This 5-gallon or 20-liter bucket filled in 5 seconds. That's 1 second per gallon, which is 60 gallons in a minute, which is 3,600 gallons in an hour, which is 86,400 gallons in a 24-hour period. Or in liters, it's 20 liters in 5 seconds, which is 4 liters in a second, which is 240 liters in a minute, which is 240 times 60, 14,400 in an hour. And in 24 hours, that's about 345 or 346,000 liters. A third of 1 million liters in 24 hours. And about 1/10 of 1 million gallons in 24 hours. So you can imagine if this water, which is being diverted from a creek, if it weren't able to flow through, what it would do to all of this area. And it's what it did do to this area before we came here for several years. And all that water was coming here and staying here and flooding all of these trees that had grown prior to when the pond had been put in, prior to when water from the creek was being diverted to that pond and eventually to here. And so we needed to be able to allow this water to flow in the same way a creek flows. So I'd like to be clear about something. this was not a wetland. If it had been a wetland, then we would have maintained it as a wetland. But it wasn't a wetland. It had never been a wetland. And one thing I would recommend to you to do if you were to buy a piece of land out in the country, we didn't do this, but if you're going to buy a piece of land out in the country, not in the city but in the country, I would recommend that you have the property inspected by your local conservation authority, and have that inspection be a condition for your offer to purchase. A satisfactory inspection from the local conservation authority. Had we done that, we might have known in advance some of the challenges that we would have faced. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe we would have been too scared. Maybe we might not have bought the property, but I'm glad we did buy the property. I'm almost glad that we didn't know about any of this, because what we have learned over the last 4 years has been priceless. And so, starting right away, as soon as thaw came in February and March of 2020, we started to dig this canal. And how did we do that? Well, I would dig a little bit, and I was doing this by hand because the soil was just liquid. And that's that was the other challenge. You see, with all this water here, there was no actual soil. It was just liquid. It was just moving. There was a lot of dead trunks in the ground, not a whole lot of soil, not a whole lot of stuff to be able to plant into in this area. And so I started digging this canal by hand, literally by hand, because with a shovel, the mud would just fall right off the shovel. I was down on my hands and knees, and I would dig, maybe a couple meters at a time, and I would see where the water wanted to go, and then I just continued. And I did that over a couple of months until I got to a little bit later on. I'll show you a little bit later on. And so when the water started moving through here, then we were able to start solving the challenges here. And one of those solutions was to create this chinampas here, which is essentially it's like hugelkultur. It's a little bit like hugelkultur, which is gardening in a pile created by logs and earth and compost. But in this case, the idea is to do it on top of a source of water. And so what you have here are those thousands and thousands of branches of buckthorn, along with branches of other dead trees that fell down, that we had to take down because they were going to fall down. And so you can see some of them here. This is full of branches and trunks, and also compost and collected leaves, and also wood chips, in sort of like a hamburger type organization. And eventually you get the branches so thickly crossing each other that the whole thing becomes quite solid. And you can walk on top of it, you can garden on top of it, you can put soil and compost on top of it. And the great thing about it is it's habitat for snakes, it's habitat for frogs, it's habitat for all sorts of animals, because they've got a whole network under there. If you can just imagine this thick network of branches full of air pockets everywhere, but also full of soil, so they can live under there. And then you put the soil on top thickly enough that the roots can develop, and then the roots will grow down through there and then reach the water that is at the bottom. And so we were able to create this large chinampas here, and we started to plant in it. And this year we harvested some ground cherries here, and we had a big plantation of winter watermelon here that we didn't even plant. It grew right out of the compost. There was a tomato over there, and there were a whole bunch of potatoes right here. And so this was the first year that we planted in our chinampas, and it really, really worked. And also, because of the fact that the water was able to flow through the property and access other areas and other gardens, what happened was the soil here became a lot less saturated. So we were able to start rebuilding the soil. Doing a chinampas like this is rebuilding the soil in a really big way. And so all of what we put in there, all the branches and so on, the leaves, the wood chips, and they're all going to slowly decompose, and the presence of the frogs and the snakes and the other little animals in there, chipmunks and so on, probably mice, etc. The presence of all those little animals in there will also create networks in there, and so as all of this decomposes, it will simply become natural, and it will reestablish at a level that this whole area used to be prior to all of the seepage of water underground, of all of that diverted water from the creek. And so the soil is being rebuilt. And after we had done that, well, the canal allowed the water to flow through the rest of the property and give water to our other gardens, but also any sort of excess water that stayed here was, in a sense, this chinampas was like a sponge, and it sponged a lot of it up, which means we're able to create other gardens a lot closer to the soil, whereas we would not have been able to do that prior to that, because the garden would have been just sitting underwater. So we have this little half moon shaped garden. We call this our moon garden, with some deer track going through it. We love to see deer on the property. So as you can see, this isn't as deep as the chinampas, because we're able to create this garden just on the surface. We started by putting a lot of plant material, dead plant material, and leaves and so on, our first fall, to get the garden ready to plant the following spring. And by putting all those leaves and dead plants and so on, they were able to decompose over the winter, keep any other plants that were growing, keep them from growing, so that in the spring we were able to just pull all of that off, all of that decomposing material off, and what we had underneath was some soil, and we were able to plant in here. And our first couple of years we planted onions here, and they did really well. So these solutions are really working. So once again, we had a problem with the invasive buckthorn, and we had a problem with the water, but then we were able to solve those. The buckthorn was able to be used to solve the problem with the water, and also making a little bit of a canal with the water, allow the water to flow. But the thing is, that water is also important. The one thing you got to remember is, it's a lot better to have water than not to have water. Obviously, if you have too much of it, you can't plant in it. But if you're able to make that water move, slow it down to where you need it, and then make it continue to move again, then it really works. And so we're able to use our challenges, and because that's the other thing, you see, as soon as this whole area was no longer saturated, then the soil underneath was no longer moving and eroding away. And so now the soil stays in place. Whereas before, when the first time we tried to plant in here and we would dig, all there was roots and dead trunks and so on under, and there was almost no soil. But now the soil is staying in place. It's not being eroded anymore by all of that water that was being artificially redirected onto the property. And so that's really worked for us. So now I'm going to show you a few of the other gardens that have been benefiting from this water that we have been able to direct through the property. And I'm also going to show you one of the areas where on our own, where the water stopped and we weren't really able to do anything about it. But that's going to be the subject of another video. This is the continuation of the canal from that green culvert that I had shown you earlier, as it makes its way slowly through the property. I basically had to dig all of this. Now it's not deep whatsoever. It's really just on the surface, because all it's meant to do is allow the surface water, the excess surface water coming off that other pond from the water that's diverted from the creek into the pond and then through here again, basically to allow it to just continue through close to the surface so that it can flow. And that way, this water can feed the land and allow the trees to start growing again. Allow them to have access to water instead of drowning in water. And so it's really, really working. Like I said, if this had been a wetland, we would have kept it that way. Wetlands are very, very important, but this wasn't a wetland. This was full of species that weren't wetland species. The other thing that I did, you can see I'm surrounded by a lot of dogwood here, which are these red branches. That's another thing I did right away. One of the first things I did, we had some dogwood on the land when we arrived. And as soon as I started working on this canal, I also took cuttings of dogwood, hundreds and hundreds of cuttings of dogwood, and I started putting it in the soil all along this canal on both sides. And as you can see, it really, really worked. And the wonderful thing about that was I could take cuttings of dogwood, and where I take the cuttings from, the dogwood would obviously continue to grow. And so one dogwood that with maybe 15 branches growing, I could take let's say 5 cuttings out of that, and suddenly instead of one dogwood patch, I'd have 6 dogwood patches. So I was really able to multiply and literally plant hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shrubs in a single season. And because of the abundance of water, all of those dogwoods took root. And I was able to do it in this type of weather with snow like this, because when the soil is wet like this, it doesn't freeze solid unless it goes down to like minus 30 degrees Celsius. So let's continue. We're going to continue walking along this canal and we'll show you where it is. So once again, you can see here the canal is continuing and it's almost reaching one of our first ponds. So you see, what's important about this is we didn't want to get rid of the water. We wanted to keep the water, but we wanted it to be able to move where it needed to move and to stay where it needed to stay. And so here we're almost at a large pond that we created. And we created that pond because we discovered where the pond is, where the water slowed down a great deal. We've got a couple of large turtles that live there, that overwinter there. We see them twice a year. We see them in the spring when they leave, probably May, and then we see them late August, beginning of the September when they come back to get ready to basically sleep for the winter. And so this whole area, we call this the pond. It's our turtle pond, and we have our turtle garden over there. So the little canal gets a little bit wider here, and it widens out and slows down into a pond that's just about 20 meters past this one. Okay, so here is where the canal comes out into our turtle pond, which is right here, and to my left, and the water continues to flow that way towards the east and eventually towards the south. Now to my right here, you can see there's another little canal, and that's because we have water arriving from basically from the property's edge, water that arrives from there and comes in this way. Now once again, it arrived from the property's edge and then it stopped and it basically flooded that whole area. And so once again, we worked to bring the water towards this pond and help fill the pond and allow the water to flow freely once again. However, we did a lot of things with that, because with the presence of the water, you can do many things. So we have this beautiful turtle pond here with a lot of really nice cattails. I also started planting a lot of native species that like water, that like wet soil. So, and we've done that everywhere. Back by the Chinampa, we have a couple of beautiful willow trees that we planted a couple of years ago. We have a couple of Kentucky coffee trees. And right here beside me, we have a sycamore tree, which also really like the wet conditions. And then back over here alongside where it's watery, there's a whole bunch of elderberry. Because we have all that water arriving, like the moon garden in the back, we created another garden right here in order to be able to take advantage of this water. You know, on a rainy day, you can see the flow of it. And so we set up this garden, and we call this our turtle garden because it's right by where the turtle lives. And in here, in this garden, we have planted barley and wheat and peas, and also sorghum. And this coming year, once again, we're going to plant some more sorghum, and we're probably going to plant some corn in here. It's just a little garden. It's one of our several, what you might call our experimental gardens. Because when I first started this garden, it was basically practically underwater. Now, I didn't build up a real thick chinampas like the chinampas in back, but I did put a lot of leaves. I put logs and branches, but not a very thick layer, and a lot of leaves, a lot of plant material. And I just basically let all of that work its way into the soil, decompose until it was in a state where in 2022, I was able to plant in this garden. And so we've had 2 harvests from this garden. So it took about 2 years to get this to be able to grow something. 2021, I tried. I planted some pumpkins in here, but the plants grew, but we only got 1 or 2 little tiny little squash out of it. That first year it didn't grow, but as of 2022, we were able to get a harvest out of here, and last year as well. And so once again, it's you know, the presence of the water close to the garden really helps, because these 2 gardens that I've shown you, we don't have to water because they get a lot of water. When it rains, the water comes, it stays. At some point late in the summer, it's going to dry up. There's less rain, and there might be times where you don't see water here. But that's the point where all your vegetables are starting to ripen anyways, and you want them, you know, for a lot of your storage purposes, you're going to want some of those vegetables to dry up anyway. So it's preferable to have drier conditions at that point. So once again, as you can see, that this abundance of water, we were able to direct it, and we were able to use the abundance of invasive plant material to create new gardens. Those challenges became opportunities to be able to grow food without having to water. So here's one last thing. Following the turtle pond, the water obviously still needed to flow to eventually come out into the creek, which is to the south of the house. This was just all mud and stagnant water when we first came here. And so as you can see, here I created all of these curves. And the idea of these curves was to slow the water down in order to be able to use it. And also because it's just pretty. I like curves. And so I just thought this was beautiful. So water flows through these curves. I built it all up in the same way as any other chinampas, using plant material, using branches and so on. And so that the water was able to flow through here. And then as you can see these stems here. These are sorghum stems. So inside all of these curves, right from the first year, right from the summer of 2020, I started planting in here. That first year in the summer of 2020, I planted okra in here, and I planted tomatillo in here, and also some basil and some peppers, and it grew really, really well. I was really surprised. And because I thought, wow, with all this water and so on, I thought it was just going to be too saturated, but it grew really, really well, and this water basically fed them. And as you can see, the sorghum, there's lots of bottoms of sorghum stem here. This year I planted sorghum and beans to grow up the sorghum, and it grew really well. And so this is another type of what you could call chinampas. And then after this area, so this is like the second ponding area, and the water continues along the fence all the way to almost to the front of the property, the front of our land, where we've got a creek that goes through, and it eventually drains into the creek, but it slows right down and it goes by another chinampas and another small ponding area, and then it goes out. So the water is able to flow through. However, you know, as with anything in nature, water will go where it wants to go, and nature will do what nature wants to do. And it's important to respect that and to be aware of that. And so there's another part of our land where the water from the back would also make its way to, but then it would stop and it had nowhere to go, and it would make major floods. And this was really close to the house, and it went right along an area where we eventually wanted to be able to, the main area where, let's say traffic area, where we'd go from the front to the back, because all of this area is dedicated to wildlife, and we don't want to, you know, bring little electric vehicles back here. We wanted to use the other side, but it would always have major floods, and that was a very, very big challenge that took us quite a bit of time to deal with, but that is going to be for another video. And so this was a big subject. You probably have lots of questions, and it'll be my pleasure to answer any questions that you have. I really love to share our experience, and so I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned some things from it, and once again, ask any questions if you got them, and we'll see you next time.